lot more options.
Recording is on.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
Yeah, so in role-playing gaming, it's called either railroading or sandbox. And I like to discuss it when I'm talking about training and game mastering. We've talked about in Therapeutic Recreation the gradient scale from the facilitator control to participant control. So it starts with the facilitator most in control. The participants don't know the rules, don't know what to do, so they rely on the facilitator, aka game master, or aka recreation therapist, etc., to guide them through all the choices and really help them learn how to play. Then as they learn and build competence and confidence, you start to get to what I call more the training wheels stage, where the facilitator is taking a little bit more hands-off approach. It's still there to help catch them if necessary, but the training wheels are still on, and the players are making more choices, but it's still a bit of a railroady environment, but the environment's getting a little wider. Now, D&D did this through the Beckme model, Basic Expert Companion Masters Immortals from Frank Metzer from 1983 forward, by starting with basic D&D just in a dungeon. And a dungeon crawl is a very more railroaded experience. Then at the expert level, so first through third level, you were at basic, and you mostly just did dungeon crawls, and that was it. Then the expert level opened you up to the great wide world of wilderness, and started to do wilderness adventures. And so they start teaching you how to make choices that are more broad. And we've talked about freedom overload, where if you give people too many choices early on who aren't knowledgeable about a topic, they'll freeze. They'll be overloaded by the choices. And you, David, of course, know about this with user experiences and everything. You're going to get a lot better efficacy from people who are new to an area with just 2 or 3 choices at a time. They still have a feeling of agency, that they still have choice. If you just give them 2 or 3 choices, then if you give them 10 or 20 choices. If you give them 10 or 20 choices, unless something really pops out for them, they're very likely to feel paralyzed by too many choices. So you start here at the basic level, facilitator control, with just giving them 2 or 3 choices at a time, heavily railroaded, but it's okay. You can also call it in therapy scaffolding or templating or a framework, where you give them very clear context. They just start learning those basic skills. Then as they grow and learn, you back off a little more. You give them the training wheels instead of so here's the example. The carts at amusement parks that are on rails that can't go any other direction, and maybe every now and then there's a switch you can go left or right. So you start with the cart that you're just along for the ride, and the GM's describing things as you go, but you really don't have a whole lot of free agency. Every now and then you get to make a choice left or right. Then you get to training wheels, where now it's a road and you're on the road, but you've got training wheels and you can take any of the roads that are paved and such and go explore that way. You've got a little bit more freedom with the training wheel option. Then as you get closer to sandbox, now they can take the training wheels off. They can start going on the dirt roads. They can start exploring more. And as you get to a full sandbox, they can blaze their own trails, forget all the roads. Let's cut through the field here and cut through the forest here. And they've got full free agency. And the GM then is just facilitating that full experience by telling them what happens. But the players really have a lot more control over how the game goes. So tabletop has this progression of more rigid, kind of closer to a video game that, like you're talking about, where you have limited choices and there's one way to do things only, or just a few ways to do things, to over time eventually getting to, and this is kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where as you get the basics taken care of, you have more freedom of choice and an opportunity for a more immersive and intense experience as you get closer to really becoming a full-blown role-playing gamer with a lot of freedom and agency. Let me go back and catch up with, any other further comments on that, Omar?
No.
Okay, what did you think of that response? Did that help clarify for you?
Yes, it did.
Okay, and it's the same thing in LARP. You have similar experiences as well. And there are sandbox video games, but they still
kind of.
Yeah, I mean, what they call sandbox is not the same as a sandbox tabletop or LARP, just because of the limitations of the code. I would say there is one really good sandbox. It's brutal. It's downright brutal. But as far as video games go, this is the most sandboxy video game I've ever seen. Do you know what it is?
No.
EVE Online.
Oh yeah, I played Eve for a while.
Yeah, it's brutal, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so slow as well.
Well, the progression, and it's just brutal because you get these conglomerates that take over everything, and every time you jump out of a portal, they hijack all your stuff, right?
Yeah, and it's ridiculous how much real life money is tied to actual things happening in the game.
Yeah, well, it's very Darwinian, but that is as sandboxy as it gets, right? The admins are extremely hands off, and it's really just every person for themselves, and the rules are very minimal, right? I mean, I'm not aware of a more sandboxy game than EVE Online. Are you?
No, because each sandbox game has its own, not
Is
just
it?
limitations, but its own kind of style that you kind of
Sure,
have to stick to.
sure, yeah,
Um,
definitely.
so not really, unless you want to do something very specific in a sandbox game, there isn't really ones that accommodate a lot.
Yep, yep. Eric, would you like to comment on anything or anything else? Anything we've said, or something else you want to cover?
Um, just curious if I missed something in the couple of seconds my audio dropped out. How is the sandbox being defined?
That
Just curious.
that there's the facilitator has very little control. So it starts with the facilitator heavily in control, and the players have very little control and very little freedom of agency in what they get to do. It's railroaded. The game master dictates how the story goes, and the players just have very limited choices to make. Then, as they progress to like the training wheel stage, the players get more freedom, and the GM is a little more hands off and lets the players think more for themselves. And then we get to sandbox. The facilitator is either completely hands off or very minimally there just to respond to the players, but the players have full free agency to do what they want to do. So they can either go on that quest or not go on that quest. It doesn't matter. It's up to the players. Does that help clarify?
It does.
Okay,
It
and
does.
Eve Online, there is no one set quest or anything. You start in a very basic spaceship, and you try to work your way up and try to survive. And it's an extremely Darwinian, brutal environment. And you usually have factions that join together and end up dominating for a while until all the minorities rise up and try to usurp that. And so you watch over the years, and I mean years, real time, as factions, the dominant factions flip flop from one to another. It'll be a Russian faction at one point, then it'll be the American faction, then it'll be European, whatever. It'll be different groups that finally come up with a strategy to usurp whoever is dominant at the time. It's very fascinating. It is extremely, like Omar says, it's very slow. It's hugely time consuming, and it's yeah, it's not my cup of tea, but it's a critical part of my research to be aware of that. And that is, as far as I know, the most sandboxy video game in existence that I'm aware of. I mean, let me take that back. That is remotely like a role-playing game. Minecraft is incredibly sandboxy, obviously.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think there's quite a few others that fall under the sandbox definition.
Yeah, but I'm talking about that's on the role-playing spectra. And they have
Okay.
added role-playing type experiences to Minecraft, but Minecraft in and of itself is a creation construction game, not a role-playing game.
Correct.
So we're talking role-playing game genres here, or formats, and without getting outside of that completely.
That makes much more sense to my brain.
What's that?
What defines?
Hang on, David. What was that, Eric?
Just saying, it makes more sense to my brain now with that added RPG element.
Yes, yeah, because we are RPG research.
Well, yeah.
David, go ahead.
Sorry, Eric. I was just wondering what defines Eve as RPG versus, say, something like The Sims or versus Minecraft.
And that's a good point. This has been part of the struggle I've had with the RPG model at rpgmodel.com, in that defining exactly what are the boundaries of a role-playing game. When is it a role-playing game and when is it no longer a role-playing game? Because you have adventure role-playing games and adventure games, and you have action games and shooters that have role-play elements. And It really is tricky. And so with the RPG model, I've been trying to define that, and I've been trying to put that all on the website. The core is a checklist of what is a tabletop role-playing game, starting with Dungeons & Dragons, the role-playing game. So whatever the checklist is that makes that a distinctive game. And this goes all the way back to our activity analysis form, right, that we've been working on. This is part of why we need an effective activity analysis form, so we can make clearer distinctions empirically between this is a core role-playing game, this is more of a hybrid role-playing game, this is not a role-playing game. Nobody has a really, really clear distinction. We intuitively say, oh, Tetris is not a role-playing game. Okay. I don't think there's much argument about that. It's not that you couldn't create a Tetris role-playing game. I'm just saying, by design, Tetris is not a role-playing game. Why is it not a role-playing game? Well, that's where we get into the activity analysis thing. And that's why I've spent the last couple of months now talking about the activity analysis form. And we'll come up with that in a little bit. So we'll come back to that. But no, that's an excellent question, David. And this is nobody has a hard, clear answer. I've been trying to answer that at the rpgmodel.com website with the different posts I put there. But nobody has a cut and dry, clear distinction. It's because role-playing games are multivariate. Mm-hmm. So what happens is the moment you start to change a variable, how many variables have to change before it's no longer a role-playing game? And so we say things like, well, you have to take on a role that's external from yourself. You have to have some sort of definition of that role. Now, in the original D&D, that's statistical rather than just narrative. So that makes it different than free-form LARP or something, or free-form improv. That there's some way of advancing the character that's besides equipment and such, that the character actually grows, advances, develops in some meaningful statistical way. So again, an RPG model, I try to define that, and it's all out there for RFCs. But there isn't a clear way. But we start with, okay, the original is Dungeons & Dragons, the original D&D from 1974. Let's start from there, and then we go out from there, and the variables start to change. And so it's kind of a hazy transition. It's not a clear-cut line. Role-playing game, not role-playing game. It's a hazy transition from role-playing game to not role-playing game somewhere out here. Tetris is not a role-playing game. We know that. So clear out here, Tetris, not a role-playing game. Dungeons & Dragons, that is a role-playing game, the original one. Well, then there's LARP and electronic and all these others, and solo adventure books and modules, and choose your own adventure, and hybrid board game role-playing games, and all the card games, and blah, blah, blah. So we get more and more away from that core, but it's a fuzzy, it's not a hard and fast line. And we're trying to figure out exactly what those variables are with the RPG model.
I think that that segues quite nicely into my current blog post. Mm-hmm. So I spent yesterday writing a blog post almost of based on my very limited understanding of role-playing game is. Mm-hmm. I've been trying to take the narrative elements of what makes a narrative a narrative. Mm-hmm. Let's say the plot, the setting, the character, the theme, and conflict, for example, and trying to fit role-playing games into that model and sort of discuss that way, just because there's a different framing of what a role-playing game is.
Right.
Which for me, I've learned a fair bit just from doing that, but obviously it wouldn't be as advanced as what you've done for your...
Yeah, but that's the beauty of these exercises. That's why we do these blog posts and get you thinking and parsing these things and breaking these things down to try to understand and explain them. Exactly.
It's very complex, though, because like even when you mention things there, I'm just like, does that fit into the narrative model? There's so many things I'm like, okay...
That's the problem with role-playing games.
You might have forced into this, but...
Yeah, that's the problem with role-playing games. They're so multivariate. There's so many variables. That's why research is challenging. So you have to be really careful about analysis paralysis, while at the same time trying to figure these things out so we can do empirical studies. And that's what we've been working on. I've got a bunch of backlog in the chat room I'm going to read aloud here to catch up, and then we'll switch back to our open forum, although this makes your open forum as well. Okay, so regarding the Ars Magica has an interesting GM system. This is from David Griffith. Each participant makes a magic user in a coven. You take turns creating a story that is designed to draw out your other participants into the world away from the coven base.
You have minor characters that are also part of the coven that are used to allow participation of all players. But each player specifically tailors an adventure to their peers. So David Jeffs, you said, so when one player is the GM, they can affect the decisions of the other player characters? David Griffith, effectively yes, but it's a focus on making a great communal story experience. Then for some reason, frowny face, then smiley face, not sure what that was in context to.
David Jeffs, interesting. Does the mechanics of the game force more of the actual role-playing rather than focusing on the dice? David Griffith, not nearly as much as, say, Fate, which is another role-playing game system, which is based on fudge. But I think it does a better job of attracting players that would be interested in that style of game. It's not a super crunchy system and relies on story to drive decisions. It would be very hard to write a published adventure for it, which might be a downfall. So thank you, David Griffith, for those comments. Thoughts on that, David Jeffs, since you were part of that conversation?
Yeah, like just from my understanding of the different games, I don't actually know anything really about Fate or Eve, and really D&D. Come to that,
right? Yeah, that's what's great though, because you're coming from a zero previous experience. That's really helping you have asked these questions fresh. Like those of us who've been around it too long, it's hard for us to ask those fresh questions. Your audio is muted. David, your audio is muted.
Oh, mine is?
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, that's interesting.
Oh, no, never mind. Never mind. I was watching the time delay. Sorry. Never mind. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
So it seems to me, just from that comment, that people sort of, they enter RPG, they explore just the general RPG community, and then they find a game which suits what they find entertaining.
Yeah, their own play style, yes. So you have some people who like crunchier, more combat-driven games or rules-heavy games. And then you have other people who like more rules-light systems and like more narrative-driven or character-driven or politics-driven. Others like more exploration. Others like more puzzles, things like that. And this is where we talk about play style. We've had a number of lectures about play style and player archetypes. And that's where that comes in a lot of different preferences. We've done a lot of talks about the different play style. So one of the ones we mentioned, even though none of the play style tools out there have been through good empirical research, but one of the ones that has been and doesn't hold up, but is often referenced, and we use it because it's easy to reference, is Bartle's taxonomy of player type. We've talked about that. So you have explorers and killers and socializers, etc. And it's on a matrix, a 4-point matrix there. And it's still, parts of it hold up, other parts do not hold up as well through some analysis. There's some papers out there doing an analysis of the Bartle taxonomy. There are better taxonomies of player style, but they haven't been around as long and have had as much review and use yet. So that's why that one gets referenced a lot. And even Bartle talks about, while there were the initial 4, he really had, closer to 8 or so types that he really wanted included. And we have on the player archetype trainee thing, close to 20 player archetypes. And again, we look at archetypes differently than stereotypes. Stereotypes are constraining and limiting. Archetypes are a starting point of a certain assemblage of traits that help you be a short form of description. So when I say rules lawyer, you can have a player who is a rules lawyer archetype, but that doesn't mean they are only a rules lawyer. They're not limited to only being a rules lawyer. There is the stereotype of rules lawyers, but we're talking about the archetype of rules lawyers. So that's some very specific traits that are observable. And we can go, yeah, that person has elements of the rules lawyer archetype. However, they also fit the, let's see, what would be one that would be kind of on the other end of the area, the storyteller archetype. So they also love telling stories and having rich stories, and they also fit that as well. And not everybody does. Not everybody's into the stories. You have players who are just hack and slash murder hobo archetypes, right? They really like to just do the combat, that it's always about taking down the next boss. And some people might stereotype that all rules lawyers are probably going to be power gamers like that, but they're not. I've seen rules lawyers who are very much story gamers and also rules lawyers. So that's why we say archetype rather than stereotype. Archetypes are just a starting point that can overlap and expand, and they're just a shorthand for a bunch of traits. When I say rules lawyer, most gamers and our trainees know what I'm talking about. I don't have to sit there and describe all the traits that make up a rules lawyer as a basic. And then I say also a storyteller. Well, now they know this trait, this set of traits for storyteller, and this set of traits for rules lawyer. Again, shorthand. So it's just like a diagnosis in mental health. If I say somebody's bipolar type 1 versus borderline personality disorder, they have a different checklist of what all those symptoms are. There's 7 or 8 or 9 traits that can be generally assumed for that diagnosis of borderline personality disorder versus bipolar type 1 versus bipolar type 2. They're not mutually exclusive. You can have borderline personality disorder and bipolar type 1 and depression and autism. Like, all these things can happen simultaneously. They're not exclusive from each other. The problem is when people get into stereotypes, that becomes limiting. And so that's why we use this archetype model in trying to describe a set of traits when appropriate. Now, many players don't fit any one archetype. They have a few traits from one and a few traits from another, but they would not fit the archetype. And what we want, for both GMs and players, we want them to be diverse and as broad as possible without being too diluted. But everybody's welcome to whatever style they like. And the reason why we want to understand this is when we're training our game masters, we want game masters to be able to recognize which archetypes are at their table so that they can tailor the game to meet the needs of those players. For example, if you have a rules lawyer at your table, if this is somebody who's a disruptive rules lawyer, so that it's to an extreme, you need to de-escalate them, and there are certain techniques to de-escalate them. Otherwise, they will disrupt the game constantly, arguing over the rules. And you want to try to get them on your side and helping you rather than becoming a battle of wills. With the storyteller, you may have one player who just loves combat. All they want is the combat gritty stuff. And another player who's a storyteller narrative type who really wants the story to keep moving. Well, combat usually slows the game down. Every time you have to do combat in most game systems, the game slows way down. In The Matrix, they called it bullet time, where literally they slowed the cameras down and showed the bullets slowly arcing by, etc., or they did the pan around, etc. There's kind of that experience every time you include, when you get into a combat situation in any role-playing game, it tends to, the story stops progressing. We talked about with Tuckman's small group theory and communication about, do you remember, any of you, I'm going to quiz you now, the 2 different paradoxes? What are the 2 different paradoxes according to Tuckman's theory of small group formation and communication? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
I should have this by now.
Yeah.
The paradox has to do
2
with
paradoxes, so just pick one, either one.
Giving up the self for the group dynamic.
That's one. Yep, that's one paradox. Let me before you say anything else, Eric, let me see if anybody else has any stabs at it. Omar, do you want to take a stab at the second paradox?
No, I'm just not gonna remember.
Okay. David, do you remember?
No, I don't.
Okay. Eric, do you remember?
No, I can't recall.
Okay, it has to do with where everybody's putting their attention.
It's right there on the tip of my brain. It's like the focus on the game detracts from the focus on the social dynamic between the actual people. Yeah, and vice versa.
So the paradox is when you have interpersonal conflict issues or just any kind of interpersonal issues that are affecting the team's efficacy. So there's working on the project, working on the actual activity, playing the game, versus working on the group dynamics. When you're working on the game, doing the project, working on the activity, you don't have time to work on, you're working on that. You're not working on the group dynamics. When you stop and work on the group dynamics, you're not working on the project, right? When you stop, so we're playing the game, and I go, David, I don't like it when you do this, this, and this. We're now no longer playing the game, right? If I'm stopping to have this conversation, And it was like, it really bothers me when XYZ. And now we're having a conversation because it's been building and building in the group, and we need to address it. But the game has stopped progressing.
Is that something which game masters lean more towards? They want to continue the game because
it depends on the situation. You need, as groups go on. So in one shots, it's less of an issue. It's all about just mostly the game. When you have an ongoing campaign that might last years in real time, where you're getting together every week for years. So the longest group I've run was 7 years, ongoing campaign, ongoing players. And I've had others that are 3, 5, etc. But the longest I've had it, and the only reason it stopped was too many people moved away, like Australia and Europe and stuff like that. And this was in the 80s. So the internet was still too primitive. The web didn't exist yet. And so I wasn't able to keep that group going because they literally moved to other countries. And that was the only reason our group didn't keep going. We have over the years gotten together on and off and picked up here and there different games, but that's not an ongoing campaign anymore. So the only reason 7 years didn't last longer was just because of people moving. And there's people out there who've been running games for 35 years ongoing every week for the most part. They're out there. So what that does is that creates a lot more tension in group issues that you have to work out, right? If you want to get from forming through the storming phase into norming and eventually get to performing, you have to address these interpersonal communication issues of a small group, of a small team. And every time you stop to address that, the work stops, right, outside of the group. But in order to do the work better, at some point you have to address these interpersonal issues so that when you get back to the work, you can do the work more effectively. And so it's a constant tension between doing the actual work and working on the group, and doing the actual work and working on the group. And if you can balance that, you keep progressing, and that's how you eventually get to performing and have a great experience. Lead to a better gaming experience. But a lot of groups don't do that, and so the groups that don't do that tend to implode. They tend to fall apart and not last. So that's one of the challenges you have to look at. So extrapolating that a little bit, combat does a lesser version of that, in that the story itself, the bigger narrative, like you can have a little micro narrative of the battle, but the moment you switch into battle mode, the story screeches to a halt. The progression of the big story now is just focused on the battle. And you've got the story of the battle, so there's still some story moving forward, but it's all about the battle now. And so the bigger story, it slows down. And so for those who are storytellers who like the big epic quest and the peaks and the valleys and all of that, some storytellers, player types, don't like too much combat. A little bit's great because it adds to the intensity and everything. But then meanwhile, you get the murder hobos who all they want is combat. That's all they care about. They don't care about the story. They don't care about the background. They don't care about the puzzles. They don't care about the rules even, other than that it helps them do the battle and win the battle. They just care about the battle. So now you've got two different players at the table, two very different archetypes, right? Now, again, it's not that they're mutually exclusive, but you do see this happen at a game table. How does the game master address that? Well, first of all, the game master can't address it if they don't learn how to recognize it. So that's why we have player archetype specialists to teach game masters to recognize traits of different archetypes in an exaggerated setting so they can notice more subtle ones later. And so they will notice, oh, I've got a storyteller at one seat and a battle obsessed player at the other, and I need to make sure they both have a good time. So I need to balance my game. I need to handle the timing so that there's story elements and combat, and story elements and combat, that I'm balancing that in a way that they still feel engaged and not excluded. If all I do that session is story, the battle guy is going to be very bored. If all I do is combat that session, the storyteller is going to be very bored. And if that keeps happening, I'm going to lose one or the other. But if it's switching back and forth and meeting the different needs, then they're more likely to stick it out, because role-playing game has learned over time that as long as it's being met, role-playing games take a while. They're not instant gratification for the tabletop ones. They're a slow progression. But as long as each session, each of their needs are being met to some degree, they're more likely to keep sticking it out and enjoying the game. Does that help clarify?
It does. I did have one question. So you mentioned the forming, and
Yes.
so how everyone figures out how everyone feels about everything. Um, does that involve the social aspect outside of the game as well? So, like, sort
Have
of
you
deciding,
have you not been in our forming, storming, norming, performing lectures yet? Have you missed those?
you did go through it a couple of weeks ago. Then I read about it. So I have like a very brief understanding, but
Okay,
not
so
like.
the forming is when everybody's being nice and polite to each other and trying not to step on toes, and
Mhm.
nobody's really doing a very good job, and they're just all trying to be very careful, and nobody really knows quite who's going to, do what, and
Yeah.
it's not a very effective time, and everybody's very polite and kind and considerate,
Mhm.
and it's hard to get much done.
Mhm.
Storming is when they start to let that guard down. They start taking chances, like, well, we need to get this work done. Fine, I'll take the lead if I have to, and and then there's conflict, and then a lot of groups never get past the storming phase. You have different people vying for control. People aren't using their complementary skills in complementary ways, and a lot of people get stuck at the storming phase and never get past it. But if they can work through that, get through the conflict, through and this theory teaches different language to help you get through those phases, especially if you're a facilitator or leader in the group. Then you get to the norming, where roles start to be assigned more clearly that are ideal to each person's skill set. And so now in role-playing gaming, that would be the fighter is going to, take the lead, and the thief is going to look for traps, and the magic, all these cliche tropes uh, start to get established of who's doing what. But that's still norming. It's not automatic. You have to declare it. Everybody says, okay, Margaret, you go do this. George, go do this. And it's all having to be explained and said aloud. It's not automatic yet. The automaticity hasn't fully kicked in yet. Where it gets to performing is when the automaticity kicks in, where it's done automatically. So it's like a basketball team going back and forth. And when they're first learning, they have to say, okay, let's do, pattern 5-2-1 or 2-3-1 or whatever. And everybody goes, well, what's that? And you have to explain it and train your group to do it. And then you're able to start doing hand signals, etc. Well, eventually, so that's kind of getting into the performing phase, where it gets to, the norming phase. When it gets to the performing phase, you know what pattern to break into and where to be. You're the guy who has the ball. You don't have to be told, get over in that corner and get yourself open. You go there automatically. You already know the isms about each other and the strengths and weaknesses about each other, and you know where to put yourself automatically to be in the ideal position to help the team succeed. And it's unspoken, it's automatic. You get into the zone, and it just happens. So same thing happens with role-playing gaming. You get to the point where everybody knows their roles really well, where to be, and handles it automatically. There's no more debate. You don't have to spell it out. It just happens. Everybody knows exactly what to do in the situation that's happening. And that's where you have the best chance for flow state. As far as these things happening outside of the game, of course, these interpersonal conflicts definitely can go outside of the game. David Griffith is commenting. So he said before, Fate has a free Fate accelerated version that is a good introduction to the system. And then he says the out-of-game situation, i.e. convention versus home, etc., can also influence which player archetype traits will be highlighted or diminished. Yes, I agree. So there tends to be, at the pickup games and the convention games, more of what I call the gamer floaters, based on my gamer floater theory. We've talked about that before.
Yeah.
These are the people who get kicked out of all the other groups because they have social and other issues, and they're not able to stay in a group. And so to get their gaming fix, they show up at the pickup games and the convention games because nobody knows better. And so they show up at those games so that they get the gaming. Well, so they disproportionately represent that particular gaming style, which is not the majority of gamers, but become what the majority of people see because, again, they're getting kicked out of the other groups. Now, there are plenty of other gamers who aren't the dysfunctional floater type, but you do see a disproportionately high level of these floaters at these pickup games until they get banned from the stores if they're really bad, or some or at the conventions and such. And then that becomes the stereotypes that people see because you see these particular traits and behaviors, and people start making the assumptions that all role-playing gamers are that way, when really there may be 1 to 5% of the population or something. But these interpersonal issues definitely become a problem. And unfortunately, I see clickiness in the gaming community as well. You'll have, players that say, oh, we won't play with that group because they play this way. And oh, that GM has a reputation for this, so we won't play with that one. And oh, I didn't like how this one said something on YouTube or Facebook, or I don't like that person's politics, so I won't play with them, even though they might be a perfectly good game master. I won't play with them because of their politics or something like that. So there's all sorts of out-of-game issues that can definitely come up. I'm not sure if that quite addresses what you're asking.
I've had one clarification. So just in my mind, just regarding the forming, storming, performing, so obviously that can be applicable to, say, like the characters in the game,
And
and
the players.
apply it to the players, like how they socialize.
Yep.
But then, is it also applicable to like the overall situation of the game, of how people change between the characters and the players, and how they coordinate that amongst themselves?
So I've seen it where in character, the group was highly effective. They were performing very well when everybody was playing in character.
Yeah.
But out of the game, they did not get along with each other at all.
Mm-hmm.
They were completely ineffective in their communication techniques. When they weren't in character and playing in the game, they could not communicate effectively with each other and would not be able to achieve goals together.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you mean? Is that kind of separation?
Yeah, that's probably
It's an extreme example,
like
but
the game discussion which goes on just within the normal socialization.
okay, that's called meta. Like if you're talking about what to do in the game out of character, that's called meta gaming or meta discussion, where you're talking about the rules. You're talking about, hey, George, you should probably go do this, and Michael, you should do this. That's all meta gaming. And there's a certain amount of metagaming that's required, but there's a lot of GMs, and we encourage it too. We try to discourage too much metagaming. There's a certain amount that may be necessary for a particular situation, especially new players. So there's a lot more meta conversation with new players because you have to explain the rules, what you can and can't do, etc. Or trial and error is what we prefer. And we prefer that people do more trial and error to learn what they can and can't do. Oh, you want to try that? Well, give it a shot. Let's see what happens. And they'll learn over time what they can and can't do. We prefer that. But lots of tables have a lot of meta discussion. And some people are okay with that. I prefer, and we try to train for, as little meta discussion as is reasonable for the forwarding the game. Whatever that means is highly contextual and subjective. But we try to shoot for as little meta discussion as possible. And I will often say, oh, that's a meta discussion. Let's just do it in game. Let's figure this out in game. Don't have this whole, like they're all trying to figure out the plot of the story and they're talking about it like, well, I think the Count is trying to usurp the throne of the Duke and blah, 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 blah. And like, whoa. Let's not meta discuss this. How about in character, your characters discuss that, right? And so you try to draw it back into the game so that then they're having the discussion and trying to solve it in character that way. What that tends to do is they tend to solve problems more from the perspective of the character than from their own. Whereas if it's a meta discussion, they tend to do it more from their own perspective and less from the character perspective. So that's why we try to keep the meta discussions to a minimum. But there are times it's totally appropriate.
But would you say that when a brand new group forms, they go through that forming, storming, performing of figuring out how much metagaming they want, how much like out of game socializing?
Yeah, because when you get to the performing phase, the metagaming is all but gone, right? You won't need metagaming discussions. Because it'll be so automatic. Other than just the dice rolls and a few other things, it'll be so automatic. There'll be very little meta discussion at the performing phase. Now, remember, don't forget so forming, storming, norming, performing. It's very important that you've got those four. And remember, there's also adjourning, intentionally mispronounced, and reforming. And reforming has different dynamics than when you're forming, because forming assumes you've never met each other before. Everybody at the table is new. That's what forming assumes. If anybody else at the table has gamed with each other before and worked together before, then it's a form of reforming. Because the advantage of forming is there's no cliques and there's no presuppositions about each other, right? You don't have an attitude and past history to draw upon. The moment there is a past history, that becomes more reforming. The dynamics are different. The clique formation and all of that, the faction formation tends to be different in a reforming situation than in a forming situation. So you've not been through that part of the lecture yet. I know that because most of you have not gotten to that stage of the lecture yet. But yeah, so forming is different than reforming, and you see a microcosm. It is possible but rare for to go all the way through forming, storming, norming, and performing in one session. I have seen it. Usually requires longer sessions than just 3 hours. When you're pushing a 5 or 6 hour session, it's more likely to see that, especially an 8 hour session. A lot happens in that time of 6 to 8 hours that you can watch an entire group go from forming to storming to norming to performing in one session. It's hard to get through all the way to performing in one session. They might get to norming. They might struggle through the forming and the storming, and they might get to performing by the end of the first session. Then when they get back together, they might have a better chance of getting to the performing stage at the next session if they have another session. And that's what's awesome about role-playing gaming is you can see this. You can watch video after video and watch these groups do that. Now, also realize that this is not a linear process. It's more of a kind of spinning around iterative process. You can frequently fall back and in and out of different phases. You're not always performing, right? You're not always running a norm. You can often fall back to storming phase. That happens a lot with groups, especially under different circumstances. So the group might get to a performing phase in combat, but fall back to a storming phase in diplomatic debate, right? When they're in front of the court with all the diplomats there, the group hasn't worked out who should say what and do what under what circumstances yet. They don't have the scaffold and framework of the combat rules. So they might be floundering in the storming phase in any kind of political complex intrigue situation. Or when they have a mystery to solve, they might not be quite clear how to solve that yet. So now they have to go through all those phases again under different circumstances to work that out to really get to it. But eventually, over enough sessions and enough different experiences, you will get a group that tends towards performing in every circumstance eventually. How long that takes varies, typically weeks to months of one session a week. But it is amazing that you can see all of that in a role-playing game. And again, it can happen very quickly in a single session. We regularly see groups go from forming to storming to performing. Now, usually those are experienced gamers. So if you do a pickup game and you only have one session, new players are going to just struggle with just the forming phase. They're never going to get to the norming phase. But if you have a bunch of people who already know the rules really well, they're experienced gamers, and they don't have any major isms to get in the way with each other personality-wise. They're all there to play a game and be cooperative about it, and they've all come together for the first time and don't have any baggage. You can see a group of experienced gamers in one session get all the way to the norming phase quite effectively, and sometimes in rare instances to the performing phase where they have a full flow state experience, and it's awesome when that happens. And it does happen, and that can happen in one session, which is miraculous compared to the theory in the normal workplace and such. That's very rarely can happen in the workplace. Omar, you want to comment on any of this?
No, I think it's pretty interesting.
Okay. Eric, do you want to comment?
No, not at this time.
Okay. Eric, are you also waiting for me for blog posting response, or did I already take care of yours?
I think I'm waiting. I mean, you did give me comments, and I sent you back final. I haven't seen it go up.
I think I did. I think I did post yours.
I saw my first one.
Oh, there's another one? Like just this weekend. Didn't I post one Saturday, Sunday?
Yeah, that was the first blog. I wasn't sure if it was a duplicate or if it had just come out for public. Yeah.
I think I made the first one public, but I think I posted. Come on, load already. I think I posted your newer one to the Patreons. Let me see here. We've had quite a bit of content come out this week, so I'll scroll through. Come on, connection work. All right, let's see here. Talk show, training, theory, Bleed Part 2, June 23rd.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but it's about the see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's the fifth one down because of the broadcasts. So, and if you want to tweet about it and help spread the word, everybody. Now, again, that's only available to Patreon supporters until July 25th or so. But that is, so we did get that taken care of. So, what are you working on now?
I'm working on extension of the second one. I reached out to Dr. Bowman, and she got back to me last night with some resources.
Wonderful.
So I will be looking through those and hopefully updating what I did last time to incorporate the resources that she's given me.
Excellent. So part 3, we'll have that. That's wonderful. Make sure you give her full acknowledgement of her responses and such.
I definitely will.
And if she said anything in the email that's quotable, feel free to include that. So we want to make sure we're showing this active community interaction. So, all right. So will you have an outline for Jonathan next Tuesday of your part 3?
Yeah, that seems realistic.
Yeah, because that's the process is you get the idea, then you take about a week to try to put an outline together. Then the next week you try to create a very rough draft, and then you kind of submit that to people for other additional ideas. And then the following week is when you then try to do the semi-final draft that's you then submit for everybody to kind of poke through. And then finally by the 4th week is your final draft, and then that's when it gets to me, and we get that back to you, and then we publish. That's the month-long cycle. Again, you can compress that into a week. Jonathan's done some of those in a week or two. But that's the expectation, is that you try to each week make that type of progress so that every month you're putting out a new one. That's the cycle I want to get everybody used to doing. So try to plan it that way. And I'll be back again, before you're done with the next cycle. But I would like to see by the time I get back that you're getting close to the semi-final draft. Okay?
Yeah,
sounds 2 weeks out. Cool. I look